I was raised in an era of barriers. I was born and raised under the rulership of the National Party here in South Africa. The National Party implemented a policy called apartheid or segregation, where the whole design was to keep people apart, particularly keep people apart from the white minority, in so doing to reinforce white minority rule in South Africa. And so the rest of the population was kept divided. From the moment you are born, you are categorized based on your appearance. You are colored, you are African, you are Asian. And as you grow up, these barriers become more and more pronounced. You're not allowed to go to a white-only school. You're allowed only to go to a school in your area that suits your appearance. You were not allowed to mix with other white people. And that's why they passed laws such as the Mixed Race Act. They made sure that people were geographically separated. When people belonging to a certain tribal group were assigned a geographical location in South Africa. And so these became independent states, so to speak, and therefore there was a geographical barrier that kept people apart. And so when we come to the section in Mark chapter 6, verses 24 to 30, we find Jesus is teaching his disciples that he is able to break down barriers that people raise up in order to keep people out. We find that Jesus goes from the geographical location of Israel into the geographical location of Tyre, a non-Jewish area. In chapter 7, Jesus got involved in a discussion with the leaders of the day, the Jewish leaders who were his opposition. They despised him and they accused him of not teaching his disciples to practice ritual cleanliness. They accused Jesus of not telling his disciples to wash their hands in a certain ritualistic way when they eat. And that launched Jesus into a oral battle with the leaders of the day. And at the end of chapter 7, verse 23, Jesus makes the statement that what makes one unclean is not what comes from the outside. That is your food, that is the land that you, or the area that you walk on, and the areas that you live in. What makes you unclean is what happens in your innermost being. In other words, that spiritual contamination is not an external problem, it's an internal problem. That since your heart is spiritually contaminated, everything that you say, everything that you do would be unclean. And Jesus would provide a permanent solution for hearts that are spiritually contaminated. And so he left these leaders with a statement that must have upset them, that no, what makes you unclean is what come out of an unclean being. That is, since your heart is spiritually contaminated, what you say and what you do will be contaminated as well. And so leave my men alone, so to speak, because I'm going to provide them with a permanent solution for a heart that is contaminated. And Jesus would shed his blood on the cross of Calvary to provide cleansing for contaminated hearts. And so he left this area in Israel, and he goes over, we are told in Mark chapter 7, verses 24 to 30. Having risen, he departed from there into the regions of Tyre. Tyre was a Gentile region, it was a region that was considered unclean by the Pharisees and other leaders of the day, and so a good Jewish man would not go into an unclean area. And so to reinforce this concept of uncleanliness and reinforce the concept that what makes you unclean is not an outside problem, Jesus goes deliberately to reinforce the lesson into an unclean area to teach his disciples that spiritual contamination is not on the outside but on the inside. But in doing so, he crosses the geographical barrier that separated Israel from the pagan land of Tyre. And we read in the second part of verse 24, having entered into her house, the house remains anonymous, he was wishing that no one would know that he was there, and he was not able to escape notice. Then in verse 25, but immediately a woman whose daughter had an unclean spirit, notice the word unclean, continuing that theme of the previous portion in Mark chapter 7. Jesus then goes into an unclean area to encounter a woman whose daughter had an unclean spirit in verse 25. And now notice the verbs or the participles that Mark uses. Having heard about him, came and fell at his feet. The woman, who was a Greek, a Syrophoenician by race, was asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he began to say to her, permit first the children to be satisfied, for it is not right to take the bread of children and to throw it to the dogs. But she answered and says to him, Lord, even the dogs under the table eat from the scraps of the children. Then in verse 29, and he said to her, because of this word, go. The demon has gone out of your daughter. And having departed to her house, she found the child laying upon her bed, and the demon having departed. Jesus is going to teach his disciples, in addition to what he had been teaching them in the Gospel of Mark, as to why they need to place their confidence in him. They are going to learn another layer to that lesson, that Jesus is worthy of their confidence because he is able to break down barriers that was designed to keep people out. Now remember, the task that he would give them was to make disciples of all nations. That meant they were to cross over certain geographical barriers in order to execute this command of making disciples. But in doing so, they would encounter a number of barriers that people raise up, either through their culture, to keep people out and to prevent them from listening and understanding the gospel. And so in this first of 3 lessons, we will discover that Jesus is able to break down the very barriers that was designed to keep the gospel out, while at the same time, by breaking down these barriers, he's teaching his disciples the lesson that he is worthy of their confidence because he alone can break down those barriers which people erect to keep people out. And so he's going to teach them an important lesson through this encounter with this woman. And so this lesson that he teaches them will function on two levels. And so we will teach and we will see what he has taught, what he is teaching them about his ability to break down barriers and what we can learn through them when we go and minister to people who erect barriers to keep the gospel out. After Jesus concluded his encounter with the Jewish leaders in Mark chapter 7, verses 1 to 23, concerning what is the source of spiritual contamination, he tells them, as I said earlier, that spiritual contamination is internally sourced from an unclean heart, rather from eating unclean foods. And to reinforce this point, he crosses over to the Gentile territory of Tyre, a region that would be considered as unclean by the Jewish leaders. And this passage tells us that Jesus goes into the region of the city of Tyre, and his goal is to escape notice by the community around him and to spend time with his disciples. In other words, Jesus wanted to have a small retreat in the city. We are told that he is staying by in an unidentified house in the city. Tyre played a very important role in the history of Israel. The history of the city is intertwined with Israel's history. There in the Old Testament we find many references to Tyre. And in many of those references, the city or the people of Tyre would come under judgment from God because of their excessive materialism. We read, for example, in Jeremiah chapter 47, verse 4, God declared that for the time has come to destroy all the Philistines. The time has come to destroy all the help that remains in Tyre and in Sidon. Amos prophesied against them also in Amos chapter 1, verses 9 to 10. Because Tyre has committed 3 crimes. Make that 4. I will not revoke my decree of judgment. They sold a whole community to Edom. They failed to observe a treaty of brotherhood, and so I will set fire to Tyre's city wall, fire that will consume her fortresses. So by crossing over into the territory of Tyre, Jesus was crossing over a clearly defined geographical boundary into unclean territory. In addition to this, in the encounter with the Syrophoenician mother, Jesus is violating a number of unseen boundaries, violating in inverted commas. And so as we look and learn from Jesus crossing the boundary that separated Israel from Tyre, we will see that Jesus is going to teach us, together with his 12 disciples, a very important lesson. And so the question that we must ask is, what lesson does Jesus desire to teach his 12 disciples by not only crossing over into a Gentile or an unclean territory, or also engaging with a distraught mother who is Gentile and whose situation is clearly one of spiritual contamination. Her daughter's body had been taken over by a demonic spirit. And so let me describe the situation in the first part of this lesson. Number one, Jesus crosses the geographical boundary of Israel and Tyre and enters an unclean Gentile area. What does he want to teach us there? Number two, where he crosses a cultural boundary by being in contact with an unclean Gentile woman. What lesson does he want to teach us there? And then he bridges a spiritual boundary by ministering in a contaminated situation. The little girl's body is being tormented by an unclean spirit. And the woman comes to Jesus, wanting Jesus to cast out the unclean spirit. This passage, Mark chapter 7, verses 24 to 30, is a difficult passage to understand. But this passage functions on two levels. On the one level, we have a devastated mother who pleads with Jesus to intervene in a distressful situation. To put it in another set of words, release and relieve my beloved daughter from the torment of an unclean spirit. That's on the one level. There's also another level in that this incident where Jesus encounters this Greek Syrophoenician mother is a transitional event. Up to now, the Jewish nation has benefited from the ministry of Jesus. He was born into a Jewish family, Joseph and Mary. He grew up in a Jewish community. His ministry, for the most part, was focused exclusively to a Jewish audience. And this incident in Mark chapter 7, verses 24 to 30, signals a coming change in his ministry. From now on, Jesus will focus his ministry on the non-Jewish portion of the population. Now those who are not Jews, but who respond to his ministry, will benefit from his ministry. This incident is transitional. Jesus is going to declare through this encounter that the time of the Gentiles has arrived. And then in the next few chapters, Jesus will prove to us that the Gentiles was always part of his plan, or the plan of God, and they were always designed to benefit from this ministry. So we have two levels now. One, a simple exorcism. Jesus is requested to cast out the demon, but on the other side, Jesus is signaling that the time of the Gentiles has arrived. And so through this encounter, we will see Jesus will be breaking down certain ethnic barriers. He will also be breaking down barriers or boundaries that would redefine and enlarge his ministry. From now on, the scope of his ministry would increase. And so, as we go on in this lesson, I want to invite you to join me as we eavesdrop on an encounter that took place between Jesus and a distraught mother pleading for him to come to the aid of her daughter. And in the first part of the lesson, we find that this Syrophoenician mother, a Greek lady, a non-Jewish lady, would be a subtle rebuke to the 12 men who have been privileged to follow Jesus. These 12 Jewish men have had a front seat to the ministry of Jesus. These 12 men followed this Jewish rabbi around the countryside in Israel, the Galilean countryside, They have witnessed his healings. They have seen him drive out demons. They experience God using them, and they have witnessed his power over nature, and they have seen him as he defeat the Pharisees in various debates. But in spite of their privileges, these men remain dense and entrapped in a state of spiritual incomprehension. So Mark is going to ask and answer the question, why is it crucial for the disciples to place their confidence in Jesus Christ? Or why is Jesus worthy of their confidence? And the answer to this question is found in this section of Mark chapter 7, verses 24 to 30, that Jesus is able to break down the barriers that people set up for themselves to keep the gospel out. And so we are going to explore how Jesus breaks down the barriers that would prevent the gospel from being heard and being understood in their Pacific area. A group of ladies who writes under the name Erin Hunter once wrote, "The only true borders lie between day and night, between life and death, between hope and loss." We are going to see how Jesus breaks down those borders that is designed to keep people out. And the disciples are going to learn, like we will learn, that we must place our confidence in him because his power is able to break down the barriers that people set up to keep people out and to keep the gospel out. And so in our next lesson, we will see how Jesus breaks down those barriers.